After loads of you asking about the latest on the Ibiza, because it's been sat in the background on the videos the past few months, I'm finally getting a chance to get back to it and getting all these jobs done. This key hasn't turned ignition for the past 2 years, so hopefully after a bunch of jobs I get to get done on the car first, I can get a chance at the end of this video to pop the key in ignition, turn it, and fingers crossed this car starts. But if you're not too sure how we got to this position, here's a quick recap for you. I went on a small road trip to purchase my first ever project car for 500 quid. It was this non-running 2007 Seat Ibiza FR. It had a blown turbo along with a mountain of other issues, and it had been sat unused for over a year. After a quick check to discover its history thanks to a pile of receipts, I then got to work, draining oil from the most random places, moving the knackered turbo, ordering a brand new one, and freshening up a lot of the car, including new brakes and alloy wheels for all 4 corners. And even though the new turbo had arrived, the Ibiza has now been sat out in the cold for months while I made videos on my Cupra. So yeah, after a pretty brutal winter, the car is now back in shelter in the garage, and I've started tackling things already on it. Now, first of all, what I'll say is I have got a lot of body work to do on the car as well. There was bits of rust I think I covered in my very first video about the issues with rust. Now, very quickly, I haven't actually done this in depth in the video, I've just done it off camera because I am no form of body shop expert. So there was rust there on the edge of the rear lens and it has been sorted, but you can see there's a colour difference. And there was a patch of paint missing there and that's been quickly done. I actually need to still sand this down and get a quick sprayer lacquer, but just a quick fix, it's nothing professional. Other things bodywork wise was this weird kind of cracked eggshell type effect of the lacquer and then this matte white on top. So this was the same and I've actually managed to kind of soften it a lot better, so it looks way better now. Although it's a matte finish, there's no actual shine to it anymore, but yeah, we'll be tackling this in a wee while. Now down here for the front brakes, you can see I've got the new caliper on the front here. So I already had painted this bracket, but now I've got the new caliper that's powder coated on the car as well. And you might notice that under here is actually looking pretty clean, and that's because I had the arch off because there was rust, really bad rust at the bottom down here, which I've managed to clean and kind of patch up. So that looks 10 times better. Again, a not professional job, but enough to make it look a lot better. And while that was off, I gave it all a good clean. And I also noticed when I was taking the car out onto the drive and moving it around a bit, yeah, there was no power steering because the car wasn't running, but you could hear the coil springs on top of the struts twisting and clonking as they're going around. This is usually because the strut top bearings are seized or really badly worn, so they're not moving as freely, and instead what's moving is the coil spring instead. I've decided to switch over the top of the strut top bearings on both sides, and I've done this side already while I was doing the whole of the arch kind of refurb, and I'll take you through the same stage on the opposite side just to show you what I did and how easy it is as well. I think I jinxed myself there by saying how easy this would be because it definitely wasn't. Going to the 3 bolts on top of the strut, one of them started spinning, which is a known issue with these cars. Bad cars, they don't have a very good captive nut system, so we'll address that in a wee while. Then going down, I removed the caliper and the caliper bracket, but then I put the caliper bracket back on because you need this to hold the screwdriver, which stops the brake disc from turning as you're removing the drive shaft bolt, which was really, really stuck. I tried lifting the breaker bar, standing on the breaker bar, extending the breaker bar as well, using my foot to hold it in place. None of this was working. So I'm so used to not having drive shafts on these hubs that I forgot that I would need to leave the brake caliper carrier on so I can put a screwdriver into the brake disc, and then that helps you take off the nut that holds on the drive shaft. But it was really stuck on, really bad. I actually stopped recording because I didn't think I was going to get it off. And there's a lot of swearing involved as well, but heat. Using that thing again, that has helped out so many times now. Heating up the nut itself so that the metal expands, and then hammering on my 36mm socket over that has managed to get it off. Yeah, it was so tight, but heating it up expands it and then it comes off reasonably easily actually. So that's one major thing done. As you saw, yeah, I've got to get somehow the captive nut inside the strut top bearing held still so I can then take off that bolt out the top of the strut. So that's going to be another challenge as well, but crack on now with getting the rest of the strut taken apart, and then we'll see how we get on with that next. So with the drive shaft nut nearly off, I just use this to tap the drive shaft to unsettle it from the back of the brake disc. And then I'm just going to remove all the other bits and pieces off the strut itself so I can then free it from the car. And this includes dealing with that pesky bolt that was spinning on top of the strut. Keep pushing, keep pushing. Oh, congratulations. It's a boy. What an absolute mission that was. Getting that strut off this side of the car. Other side was super easy. I don't understand why this side was so hard. Cut the drop link in half with the grinder. Yeah, it just wasn't coming undone. Couldn't get it on either end. So now I've got the hassle of getting them off somehow either side, but it's a lot easier now with the strut out of the way. The third bolt on the top of the strut tower, which is up here, which we knew was going to give us an issue, was this one just in here. Because it's tucked in the back, there was no space to get a grinder. I was just going to get a grinder and just grind the head off, and then that would be it, but couldn't get a grinder in there. So what I did was just try to hold it with this on the other side, underneath, you know, underneath the arch, hold up there and undo the nut and undo the bolt on the top, but that didn't work either. It just kept spinning inside the vice grips the whole time. Then I used heat, nearly set fire to the top of the strut in the car, and then finally I was like, right, the only option left is to drill the bolt out. If you haven't drilled bolts out before, it does work, but it takes ages. I've got really high quality drill bits that are made for drilling out bolts. So start off with your small drill bit first, then work up to a medium sized bit, and then you're looking to work up to a drill bit size that's about the same size as the bolt itself. And there you go, if that focuses, that's the hole that I drilled. I drilled it as far through as possible, and then once I felt like I got to basically far enough through that bolt there, so it actually was reaching the top of the strut tower, I put 13mm socket on top with the ratchet, and then I used the vice grips again on the bottom to hold the bit that should be staying still, and I twisted it, and within half a second, as soon as I twisted it, it just snapped off the top, and then the whole thing dropped out and it was all free. So brilliant, all done. Anyway, it's now midnight. I'm off to bed now. It's too late to be doing any more, especially if I'm going to have to grind anything else. I shouldn't do now, actually. But stripping the arch and getting it all off and getting it looking a bit better, and some new bits on, including the strut top bearing, we'll have to get done tomorrow. So I'll catch you then. So the very next morning, straight back into the garage to get the spring compressed and get the old strut top bearing off and put the new one on. These spring compressing clamps are pretty reliable. They've got a double hook design which holds them pretty secure. I've seen some quite dodgy clamps over the years, and these work fairly well. Then there's this trick of using a microfiber cloth around the piston of the strut with some vice grips to hold it dead still, and then you can use an impact gun just to take off the nut from the top of the strut. This works quite well actually if you haven't got a special tool to remove that nut. Now we'll come back to this strut just in a wee while. Now to get this arch liner off, and then the arch itself, and then we're going to start cleaning up this inner arch. So there's a standard Torx bits around the inside of the arch liner. Take them out along with some plastic clips. Carefully pull out the arch liner then from behind the arch and just yeet it onto your driveway. There's then this secondary cover at the back of the arch you need to remove as well, same as on the Leons. Take that out and also remove the indicator light as well. A quick check down at the base of the wing, you can see the damage with the rust here is common in all kind of VAG group cars. And then we're just checking for all the available bolts we've got to remove to take this wing off the car. So once the arch is then removed and out of the way, we get clear access to the whole side of the car here, and we can see all the bits we need to address that are covered in rust or just surface rust. I'm then going to check the arch outside, so we can see definitely this is a second-hand wing that's been put on the car. It used to be blue obviously, and the rust is just as bad as this I imagine on the old wing. So we're going to try and take off as much rust as we can, the surface rust, and try and see if we can stop it from getting any worse over the next few years. So my first thought was just to get a wire brush and take off as much of this rust with the wire brush as possible around all these nooks and crannies, especially down here at the base of the wing where it was really bad. Then I used some of this Genolite rust treatment stuff that I bought a while back, which I just spray all over all the rust parts and it turns black over time and is meant to stop the reaction of rust happening for a wee while. Then out with some white paint to treat the top edge here, which wasn't really needing primed but just needed touched up with some white paint because the blue paint was coming through again. And then using a wire brush down at the base beside the door on the sill here to take away all the loose surface rust that was around these two bolt holes. I then took the wire brush around the inside of the arch here, taking off all the loose surface rust because there was nothing that was actually rotten or any holes at all. It was just all on the surface, and taking off as much as I could before we start treatment. Then again spraying Genolite rust treatment all over the areas, and at the same time as that was drying inside, I went outside and put some primer along the top edge of the arch. So while waiting for this to all dry, I then got my brand new strut top bearing, which was replacing this rusty old knacker one. You can see the knacker part there where it holds the captive nuts. They should stay still in this bearing, but obviously they spin. when you try and take them off. This brand new one, nice and smooth compared to the old, kind of creaky, knackered one. So I put some copper grease around. I maybe use copper grease for far too many different reasons, but I put some around the bottom of the strut here so that the spring wouldn't start to stick in the base of the strut itself. And then carefully putting the compressed spring back onto the strut. And then transferring across the rubber boot that goes over the piston to cover it and stop it from getting dirty, along with the bump stop that I put inside the new strut top bearing. It is quite hard to try and line these all up so that they sit snugly on top of the spring before you get the nut on. That's the hardest bit. You make sure the piston is all the way out as well, so enough threads are showing through and you can start to catch them with this nut. Then the same method again, using the cloth and the vice grips to hold the piston of the strut still while you put the nut back on nice and tight. I'm not 100% sure on torque settings for this top nut, hence why I'm using my torque wrench, so I don't recommend you this at home. I'm being a cowboy here, so don't copy me. And then finally carefully taking off the spring clamps from the spring. Now once the inner arch had dried from its rust treatment, I applied this wax oil matte black underseal spray. Now this makes it just look one nice uniform colour, it's not too shiny. There probably is better products on the market out there, I just had this in the cupboard to hand to use, so I went ahead and sprayed both front arches with this stuff. So a wee update now on where we stand at with the car. So this corner is now back together pretty much, apart from the brake caliper and the carrier putting back on. But yeah, all kind of scraped back rust-wise, treated with this undersealer stuff. Shock absorbers back on, new top mount is now in as well. And with the drop link that I had to grind off basically, I had to order 2 new drop links, just a pair, on eBay for 13 quid, which is quite a bargain. But this is the issue when you order loads of parts through various places. I usually do Autodoc over the last couple of years, and I preempt jobs. So I order bits thinking, I'll order that just in case, because I'm doing the order, I'm paying delivery charge, and I order some drop links for an Ibiza just in case. I had a pair of Ibiza drop links in the cupboard with the rest of the spare parts that I keep just in case, and I'm going to order a second pair. So anyone wants a pair of Ibiza drop links, yeah, give me a shout. One more thing as well that I want to start doing just now is get this primed and painted where the wing goes back into the sill, so get that sorted. And as you saw with the wing that I was doing earlier on, that's now been rust treated with Genelite and the rust taken off as best I can. It's been primed as well, and I'm just going to get a couple of coats of paint. It's the proper paint code for the car, although when I have used it, as you saw earlier on, it's not matched properly to the paintwork that's on the car. I'm not sure why that is. Again, I'll explain to you in a wee while, which you probably already guessed by now, what I'm going to do with the bodywork of the car once we've got this car MOT'd and a bit more time, what the plan is with the car, and why I'm not too fussed about the quality of this paintwork. As long as it's smooth, as long as it's rust free, there's a certain reason to why I want that preparation for the next stage. So as I step over the carrier that's been sprayed with lacquer in a pile of beer bottles, that's not a one day's sitting by the way, you have that's better. Sorry, I changed lenses here because my lens was going all misty and dreamy like. Anyway, yeah, as I was saying, there's one thing I forgot to say at the start of this video, which was I've had this stuck here for about 2 or 3 months. Can you see that there? Little wee piece of metal. Now, that came out of my intercooler. So I cleaned my intercooler, as you might see in a few clips there, what I did when I was doing cleaning bits off screen. And I cleaned out the intercooler, and as I had it drying off and evaporating, I picked it up and I heard this rattling noise, and that fell out of the intercooler. Tiny wee shard of metal. Now it makes sense because if you had seen pictures of the turbo, the fins on the turbo were all really badly damaged because the it came off its shaft, on the bearing shaft, whatever it's called, and the turbo was kind of wiggling around inside the housing, and all the fins were catching the edge of the housing and just chipping off. But if that wee shard was in the intercooler, there's a good chance other wee bits of metal from the turbo have come off as well, and that they will be situated inside the engine somewhere. So from the turbo, there's a bunch of pipes then that take the kind of boosted air around towards the intercooler, through the intercooler, and then up, once it's been cooled from the intercooler, up into the engine, through the intake, and it could be stuck inside the cylinders. So I'm going to inspect the cylinders quickly with a camera as best I can. It's a really cheap wee kind of inspection camera. I'm going to look in the cylinders, see if I can see any bits of metal in there, just in case. I'm going to take off the sump, I think, and then empty it all out, give it a really good clean just in case there's somehow bits of metal in the sump. I don't even know if that's possible, but I thought might as well do that as well. Do my full service as well, drain all the oil out, so if there is wee shards maybe in the oil system, that will be taken out. If there's any wee bits of metal in the oil filter, I'm going to have that changed as well, so hopefully eliminate any wee places that this other bits of metal could be stuck. That's the plan, that's the worst headache I've got. So anyway, let's start cracking on with all those wee jobs and try and get this car back together to start turning the key as soon as possible. So as I said, I wanted to tackle this bit, the bottom of the sill here where the wing bolts into, get that primed and painted, ready to put the wing back on. So I just masked up the edge of the door, edge of the arch, and just covered it loosely with some plastic to try and cover as much area as possible that wasn't going to get sprayed with paint. After rethreading these holes, because they were covered a bit of corrosion, I then popped the bolts back in as well. This has stopped the threads of these bolt holes from getting covered in any primer or paint, and also means I can paint the tops of these bolts at the same time. So a few coats of etch primer on this part of the sill, and then of course I had the wing still sitting outside with some primer on it, so I went back outside and coated it with some white paint. Now while that paint was drying, I then went back into the garage to fit the drop links. Now I took the pressure off the suspension by jacking up the hub assembly. This compresses the suspension to kind of normal ride height, and then fitted the drop links. You do all your tightening up with drop links or other suspension components with weight on the suspension, if that makes sense. So I quickly made sure I tightened down these bolts here. I'd forgotten to torque them down to spec, and then quickly cleaned the strut top area itself. It was time to refit the ECU back into its clip housing at the side here. Old brittle plastic, as you expect, this just broke off and went into the engine bay somewhere. So a quick bodge by drilling a hole into the plastic here and then fitting with a cable tie. Then finally getting the brake assembly back together, so the carrier and then these brand new powder coated calipers that I'd bought for the car and had them powder coated locally. And as I've done previously on the rear of my Leon, I've now coated these new calipers with ceramic coating. So it's a really cheap coating, but it seems to help when it comes to washing the car every week or so, that the brake calipers clean up really nicely each time. Oh, and of course popping back on the brake line, and I'll bleed these brakes later on. Time to change the oil on the car. Now when I took this oil plug out, you can see the quantity of oil that came out of the engine was not a lot. This will explain why most of the oil was in the intake system, intercooler and exhaust. I must have got about a litre of oil out of the engine, which is quite scary to think. Thinking I was working on a TFSI engine here, I took off the bottom of the oil cooler unknowingly, and it just had oil coming out everywhere. Tightened that back up to then go to the top of it instead to find the oil filter housing, which I loosened and popped out the old oil filter. Then I removed all the Allen-headed bolts around the base of the oil sump here to remove it from the engine. I drained out the last little bit of oil that was inside the sump here, and then I found this weird bit of orange plastic that was in there, so I'm not sure exactly where that's come from. And then what I'm doing here is I've got a magnet, which I just wanted to wipe backwards and forwards inside the last part of the sump through the oil to see what kind of bits of metal it picked up, if there was any at all. So then it was on to a thorough deep clean of the sump to make sure there was no residue left in it at all, and also remove all the old gasket that was around the top of the sump as well. It looks like this has had 2 layers of gaskets applied over the last number of years. Maybe it hasn't leaked before, someone's just applied gasket. So I want to clear all this old gasket off to make sure it's a brand new surface, then I could apply brand new instant gasket to. I also cleaned up the face on the bottom of the engine as well to make sure it had a nice clean surface to mount to, and also cleaned up the oil pickup pipe as well. And then applied this instant gasket, which you can get anywhere online, and just put a very thin bead around the edge of the sump. I then carefully put it up to the bottom of the engine, making sure I wasn't smearing any instant gasket until it was properly ready to go into place, and then just lightly tightened up the bolts around it. I think it says to be half an hour to an hour to leave it to kind of harden a little bit, and then you properly tighten it up. So with the scene there, I've got the sump back on. It's quite awkward to get the bolts that are up inside beside the flywheel bit. They're a bit tricky. You can actually lose one of the bolts in that bit if you're not too careful. Anyway, what I got, I don't know if you saw in the pictures there, the footage, what I got in the sump was quite a lot of wee bits of metal, and you'll get tiny wee shards. If you've seen my service video on the Cupra, you get tiny wee filings that appear, but you can probably see these bits are a fair bit bigger, and that is all metal. Using the magnet here. So whether that is, well, I imagine it is a turbo. It's part of the turbo probably, just as it's been chipping away off the housing of the turbo. The wee turbine blades have been getting dug away at and landed in the oil. So hopefully that's the majority in the sump, and I haven't actually looked through the filter yet, but I imagine there'll be bits in the filter as well. And it's gathered it all up and stopped it from getting anywhere else. But anyway, that doesn't matter. That's the least of my problems just now. I thought off camera I would just do the simple job of changing the glow plugs over. I've only got 3 glow plugs there because, surprise, surprise, the 4th glow plug, you see it's down there in the cylinder head, stuck. The top of it's come off and the rest is still stuck there. So that's now a new challenge for me to try and get that out. just don't know why they're so tight. They can be a pain if over tightened, and there's no need for it at all. I think it's 6 Newton meters to tighten them up to with some copper grease. But yeah, that fourth glow plug was just, yeah, I thought it was moving, but as soon as I moved it a little bit more, it just snapped. Anyway, let's crack on and deal with these issues. So since that last segment you just saw there, it's been about 2 days. I've kind of calmed down. I was pretty peed off about that glow plug being stuck in the head. Since then I've spoken to someone from work who's got a welder. He says he'll come by at some point with the welder and weld a nut onto it, and hopefully the heat as well will hopefully extract it. So I'm going to leave it alone completely just now. Have started like taking off the rocker cover to get a new seal on it, because I could see black silicone around the edge of the rocker cover sticking out around the edges, and it turns out it's got a seal on it, but it's also been silicone sealed as well. So I'm going to clear all that up and get a new seal on the rocker cover and put it back on, and then all I've got to do then is get that glow plug out and get a new one in. I'm not too sure if you can start a car on 3 glow plugs and not 4. I imagine you can. Probably not the best for it, but I'd rather have that glow plug out completely and a new one in before I start turning the key for the car. So yeah, like I said, let's get on now with the rest of the jobs in the car, under this bonnet here especially, and look to get this car started as soon as possible. So with the rocker cover out the way, I then cleared up the top of the surface on the engine to make sure it was nice and clean for putting a new gasket on. Then fit the new gasket to the base of the rocker cover here, and then tightened up the rocker cover onto the engine. Moving on to the fuel filter next, and this just is a brand new kind of area for me. I've never done a diesel fuel filter changeover before, so removing these clips from the top of the fuel filter housing, you take off the old seals as well. You get 2 brand new circular seals to go into this part here as well. Then removing the fuel filter itself, popping a new one in place, and then just refitting all the hoses back onto it, including the 2 new seals. Then to replace this water hose that I found was damaged on the engine, so I got a brand new water hose sent up. I managed to find the part number, which I've kind of covered in a previous video on the channel, which I'll leave linked down below in the description. It's quite hard to find part numbers for water hoses, especially because they're not usually printed on the hoses. But once that was changed over, I had that routed around to where it will be underneath the coolant top-up bottle. And then fitted the vacuum control unit back onto the car along with the coolant bottle, and now it's time to tackle the turbo. So I used a blanking plate for the EGR valve because this has been blanked off in this car, so I blanked off the one on the turbo here. I then was looking about fitting the oil drain pipe off the base of the turbo to see how that would fit. And by looking at an old picture of the old turbo, I could see I had to turn the housing about 90 degrees to get it to all lined up correctly. I bought various assortment of green O-rings to replace the old O-rings on the various intercooler pipes. I switched these over, and then went about fitting the intercooler back onto the car along with all this additional pipework. With the space in the engine bay, I thought I'd lubricate the top of the gear linkage to make sure it moved freely, and then pop the battery tray and airbox back into place above it. I just refit the turbo back onto the engine. Obviously this is a reverse process of what I did in the previous video when I took the old one off. So that's the engine pretty much 95% back together now. I've been at it the last few nights. I don't know if it's come across on camera like that, but every night I've just been chipping away at it after work or before work. So the biggest headache with this really was when I did the turbo at the back down there, the oil feed line, so the oil feed that comes from the engine to feed the turbo with oil, comes from the front of the engine down here and it goes up and it wiggles its way around the back. So when I took it off, I must have bent it out of shape to get it out through all the nooks and crannies. And when I've put it back in, I've not really realised that, and it's not sat right in the perfect position, so I've had to kind of bend it back in carefully so it sits nice and loosely in the right location, and then screwed it all tight. So it's all nice and tight now. As you saw, I did prime the turbo with special stuff from, I think it's liquid moly or something. What's it called? Some special oil that's used for priming turbos before they get started for the first time. So that's been done. I'll need to put in oil just now because it's completely empty of oil. I need to get another oil filter because the one that came for the car was the wrong one. Didn't realise until like last night when I was about to put it in. It's the wrong shape, so I need to order one. Sorry, I have ordered one, but I might put the old one back in along with new oil, and then my thoughts are run that for maybe a couple of days or so, then drain that oil out with the old filter, put a new filter and new oil in again, and hopefully that'll take out the last of the residue of the bits of metal and stuff that were lying in the engine that we found in the sump. That's the plan with that. What else? Sean, the guy who did my wheels, refurbished them for me. He works on these engines quite a lot. He's really into doing mechanical stuff as well. And he said if I'm worried that there could be oil lying in the cylinders, that I could take the glow plugs out, or 3 out of the 4 glow plugs out, and then just turn the engine over and it should force any oil out through the glow plug holes. I really hope there's not enough oil for that to happen. I hope it's just oil residue on the pistons and nothing more severe than that. So what now? Well, I've got to get this finished off, so just need some lacquer on this corner here before I put the wing back on, get the plastic off, get the wing back on, the bumper on, take it outside for a wash. I also need to sand down that driver's door where it's got that kind of cracked eggshell effect paint. I'm going to sand that so it's nice and smooth, then give the whole car a wash like I said, and then once I fill it up with oil, I may start the engine. I don't know how long this video is going to end up being. I hope it's not too long for you to watch. So I'm going to try and stick to my promise and get this key turned before the end of this video. So I did fill the car up with oil that night, and the following day I took it out onto the driveway to then treat the inside of the car with vinegar to try and kill all this mold. And so far, after a couple of days, it has actually worked really well. It does smell obviously of vinegar for a wee while afterwards, but it does gradually fade away. I then popped the wing back on, just with a few bolts holding it in place, and tried to line it up as best I could with the side of the bonnet. And yeah, that even involved pulling on it, so yeah, I don't advise you do this to your wings. Now to tackle this weird cracked eggshell effect on the paintwork of the driver's door. So I used this detailing sander, I think it was Black & Decker, and I just had, I think it's a 600 grit sandpaper on the bottom here, and I just basically sanded the side of the paintwork with this back and forth until it made a nice smooth transition from the bottom part of the door up to the top. And it does look a mess still, but if you haven't already guessed, I'm planning on wrapping this car at a later date, so stay tuned for that. Obviously subscribe if you want to catch my first ever attempt at wrapping a car. And the final stage here was just giving the car a quick snow foam and wash. So now down to starting this car. So I took out the 3 glow plugs I could remove obviously from the engine and placed a towel over the front of these exposed ports where the glow plugs would go, with a plan now to start the engine and see what comes out. As you can see, there is some oil stains on the towel, and they're looking closer at the ports for the glow plugs. You can see there is some oil coming out of there as well, but it's not actually as much as I thought would have come out. I then popped the glow plugs back in, connected 3 out of the 4 of them up to the wiring for the glow plugs, and then it's time to start the car. So we've got some fuel, time to start this car and see what happens, and if that oil in the cylinder is going to cause a problem or not. Surprised how well it started there actually, and the initial smoke, and that was because the exhaust disconnected, so all the fumes came out the back of the exhaust behind the engine and up through the engine bay. A few outstanding issues like the airbag light and the wipers not working in the front. We'll get that addressed in the next video, and hopefully MOT as well, but the main thing is it's running, it's going, and it potentially is the start of this car getting finally back on the road. If you want to catch the next video, obviously hit the subscribe button down below, hit the thumbs up and enjoy the video, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.